It's 1992, and the world is falling apart. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union is disintegrating, its flaming wreckage tumbling down onto a frightened post-imperial land. From these ashes will rise new nations, each attempting to understand what it means to be free. For some, this will be like stepping into sunlight for the first time, an impossible dream, finally made flesh. For others, it'll be nothing short of a nightmare, a dark future that they must fight at all costs. And fight they will. As Moscow's iron fist splinters, wars begin breaking out. In Georgia, Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Chechnya, its conflicts fought with a brutality that will leave deep psychic scars. Yet it will be the least known of these conflicts that arguably winds up having the longest lasting effects of all. Fought in Moldova in 1992, the Transnistria War sets the precedent for post-Soviet conflicts, with its atrocities, separatist Russian forces, and direct interference by Moscow. I wrote the playbook for how these wars unfold, a playbook that sadly is still being followed today. Amid the gentle hills between the Prut and Dniester rivers in Eastern Europe lies a slice of land that's been contested for centuries. Once part of the ancient Principality of Moldavia, this Maryland-sized place would, in the early 1990s, become ground zero for the nasty ethnic conflict that's at the heart of this video. To understand why that happened, we first need to get our heads around its history. A history spent almost entirely dominated by one imperial power or another. Prior to 1812, this area was one of the furthest provinces of the Ottoman Empire, only to then fall to the Russians, who renamed it Bessarabia. Yet the majority of its mostly peasant population didn't feel very Turkish or very Russian. Instead, they felt they had more in common with those to their southwest, those living in what we'd now call Romania. Born from the mid-19th century merging of two kingdoms, the Kingdom of Romania was originally a fusion of Wallachia and the Moldovan lands not controlled by Russia. For those living in the Moldovan lands that were controlled by Russia, the arrival of a strong independent nation that spoke their language and had their customs was mostly a case of, awesome, we totally want to be a part of that. But with Tsarist Russia still standing strong, there was little chance Bessarabia would ever get to reunite with the rest of Moldavia. Thankfully for everybody who doesn't want this video to end right now, Tsarist Russia wouldn't be standing much longer. The outbreak of World War I was the slow-motion football in the groin that sent the Russian Empire crashing to its knees. By the time Lenin and the Bolsheviks took power in late 1917, the Great War had left the Russian bear so weakened that many of its ethnic minorities were able to make a break for it, including in Bessarabia. On February 7th, 1918, a peasant and a soldier uprising overthrew the Russified elite, proclaimed a Moldovan Republic, and then almost instantly voted to dissolve that republic and be annexed into Romania. It was a triumph of ethnic nationalism. But not everyone had managed to become part of this expanded state. Across the Dniester, now the Romanian-Soviet border, a whole bunch of Moldovan villagers were stuck on the East Bank wondering, well, what do we do now? Nor were they the only ones upset by the new border. In Moscow, the Soviets refused to accept the legitimacy of Romania's annexation. Since Moldovans all had lived together in the Russian Empire, Lenin and co felt they should now be a part of the USSR. In 1924, they tried to entice them back, setting up the Moldovan Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic on the east bank of the Dniester as a sign that Moscow would guarantee Moldavians minority rights. But it wouldn't be rights that eventually drew Bessarabia back into Moscow's orbit, but another great war. For the lands between the Prut and Dniester, World War II was like spending 5 years as a wrestling mat for a pair of pissed-off randy savages. Now, we did a whole video on this over on Geographics if you want details, but the short version is that Romania and the USSR fought tooth and nail over this scrap of land, a fight in which Nazi-backed Romania committed as many atrocities as Stalin's marauding Red Army. By the time the dust settled, what had once been Bessarabia had been forcibly put back under Moscow's boot, fused with the settlements on the Dnieper's east bank to form the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic. But World War II's legacy ensured this would not be a happy marriage. From the perspective of those who'd wanted to stay in Romania, the new status quo was an illegal occupation, one made worse by a strict policy of Russification that banned the Latin alphabet and relegated their language to second tier. From the perspective of the East Bank dwellers, their new countrymen were traitors who'd backed the Nazis and would force the whole of Moldova to be Romania's given half the chance. Not that there would be many chances in the Soviet system. Under such a strong dictatorship, open ethnic competition in the Moldovan SSR was an impossibility. While they might grumble in private, both sides rubbed along in public, not least because doing otherwise would earn them a VIP ticket to Siberia. But while Soviet Moldova appeared calm, beneath the surface, dark forces were churning. Things that a wise puppet once warned against, like fear, anger, and hate. When they finally came bubbling up, it would be on a tidal wave of blood. It's sometimes said that bankruptcies happen slowly, then all at once. The same can be said of the disintegration of Moldova. For years, the state managed to chug along as its systems failed and divisions reopened, only to suddenly collapse into a bloodbath. The trigger for this slow slide into disaster? Glasnost. One of Mikhail Gorbachev's 1980s Soviet reforms, Glasnost meant the end of political repression, the opening up of the USSR to new ideas and political movements. For the first time, people could tie their identities to something other than obedient communist, to ethnicity, for example. In the Moldovan SSR, that meant a resurgence of pro-Romanian sentiment. 1989 saw the birth of the Popular Front, a movement dedicated to all things Romanian, from the return of the Latin alphabet to the replacement of Russian as the national language. While not in government, they still wielded enormous power on the streets, enough so that in August the Supreme Moldovan Soviet caved to all their demands. The language overhauls that summer were accompanied by a street festival atmosphere to the west of the Transnistria as crowds gathered to cheer and wave Romanian flags. For those partying, it was like pressing a great reset switch that promised to undo decades of communism. But for those of different ethnicities, the Russian speakers of the East Bank, or the Turkic-speaking Gagauz people of the South, the announcement was less a party and more of a wake. Before their eyes, the Moldova they'd lived in was being stripped away, bit by bit, replaced by what felt scarily like a precursor to a second Romanian annexation. It was a feeling that would only get worse. On Christmas Day 1989, Romania's mad communist dictator was overthrown and executed, sparking an openness unknown for decades. For the people of Moldova, that openness was literal. The new Romanian government opened its border on the Prut River to Moldovans, who soon responded in kind. That March saw the Moldovan SSR hold its first free parliamentary elections. The Popular Front dominated, bringing other pro-Romanian parties into a grand coalition. What followed was exactly the sort of legislation a country hoping to get annexed would pass. The Romanian flag was adopted, along with the Romanian national anthem, a bill passed giving Moldovan law supremacy over USSR law. Yet the parliament would never quite pull the annexation trigger. Perhaps spooked by polls showing the population backed independence, they shied away from reunification, even as their most extreme supporters pushed for it. Unfortunately, that shying away isn't what Moldova's ethnic minorities saw. No, they just saw the red, yellow, and blue flags, the protesters screaming for Bucharest to come take them and draw their own conclusions. The first ones to jump were the Gagauz. On August the 19th, 1990, they declared independence, establishing a tiny homeland in the country's south. Without their own armed forces, Moldova's parliament mustered a militia to stop them, but Soviet troops still stationed in the country forced them to turn back. It was all the encouragement that Russian speakers needed. On September the 2nd, the East Bank crossed the Transnistria River, declared its independence from Moldova as a brand new Soviet republic within the USSR. Sadly for newly created Transnistria, though, the same Moscow they longed to cling to was busy ghosting them like some weird unwanted ex. For Gorbachev, the Transnistria thing was just too messy to deal with, especially since party loyalists in the separatist republic were telling him the whole adventure was a bad idea. Communist cadres even tried setting up a rival government to the separatists in Dubasari in a desperate attempt to keep Moldova whole. But with the entire USSR now splitting at the seams, keeping even tiny Moldova together would soon prove to be impossible. First blood was spilled in November 1990. On a chilly day, Moldovan police tried to cross the river into Transnistria, only for locals to block the bridge with their bodies. In the scuffles that broke out, 2 people were killed. Not enough to spark a full-scale war, but enough to reach into the brains of everyone in the region, grab the little dial marked paranoia, and crank that thing up to 11. Over the rest of 1990, so-called self-defense militias began forming across Transnistria. The next year, they merged under an umbrella command into the Transnistria Guard. But it would take another declaration of independence to turn them into an army of war. August 1991 saw Moscow hardliners try to depose Gorbachev and reinstate the old, repressive USSR. Although the coup failed, it sent the Union's republics scrambling for the exits. Declarations of independence swept Eastern Europe and Central Asia, Moldova among them. But when Moldova declared independence, it did so while laying claim to all its Soviet territory, including the Gagauz homeland, including Transnistria. When the Transnistrians immediately voted to rejoin the USSR, it was clear things had reached a breaking point. The ethnic lines had now been drawn, old bitter memories reawoken of the blood-soaked 1940s. If either the Moldovans or the Transnistrians wanted to secure their futures, they were going to have to fight for them. As 1991 swept by, a campaign took shape on the Dnister's east bank, a campaign to take over the old institutions of Soviet power and place them under separatist command. In some cases, this was as easy as walking into a school, government office or police station and being like, "Hello, we're splitting away from the losers. Wanna join?" Other times, though, the takeovers were built on intimidation, on things like surrounding a building with armed men and making it clear that those inside either swear loyalty or enjoy a fulfilling new life with a serious concussion. By the end of the year, most East Bank institutions had either fallen in line or fled, with one glaring exception: Dubasari. A small city located on the Dniester, Dubasari was also the place least inclined to follow the separatists. Despite gangs of armed men surrounding the police station on 2 occasions, it remained firmly in pro-Moldovan hands. And that would make it the perfect ignition point. Things started to get serious around Dubasari on December 13th, 1991. That day, Transnistrian guards and Moldovan forces fought for control of the bridge spanning the river, a skirmish that resulted in 20 dead separatists and 4 dead Moldovan police. Although things quietened again in the aftermath, this brittle peace couldn't last. By now, the separatists had some 20,000 men under their arms, a mix of volunteers, paramilitaries, and pro-Russian Cossacks who'd crossed the border to fight. Moldova, by contrast, was relying on its police forces. With no regular army, the role of soldier fell to several thousand policemen, still loyal to Chisinau. Fittingly, it would be the fates of some of these policemen that finally sparked the war. To try and tell the story of what happens on March 1st, 1992 is to try and wade through reams of propaganda, obfuscation, and outright lies, while hoping you might blunder into the truth almost by accident. The Transnistrian leaders in Tiraspol claimed Moldovan police ambushed and killed one of their paramilitary leaders that afternoon, sparking a backlash. Those in Chisinau said it was all a smokescreen for a pre-planned attack. Whatever the truth, that evening saw Cossacks and separatist forces march into Dubasari and surround the police station. Although those inside tried to call for backup, the phone lines were cut. Shortly after midnight, the Cossacks stormed the building. All 32 policemen inside were taken hostage. In terms of lives lost, it was a near bloodless operation, but in terms of symbolism, it was like vaulting over the Rubicon. As Dubasari's remaining pro-government officials fled to the nearby commune of Kosieri, Transnistria's leaders put the breakaway state on war footing. When the sun rose, it was on a militia marching towards Kosieri, demanding to destroy this last loyalist pocket on the East Bank. That afternoon, a small yet bitter skirmish took place near the village. Although tiny compared to the battles to come, it marks an important point in today's story because it's here, on a cold day in early March 1992, that the Transnistria War officially begins. By the time it ended, hundreds would be dead and the former Moldovan SSR permanently torn in two. The first 10 days of conflict passed in uneasy quiet, the sort of tense silence you get when everyone knows something really bad is going to happen, but no one knows exactly when. What they did know, though, was where. After the small skirmish on March the 2nd, the separatists had been driven back to Kosieri. While that was great for the pro-Moldovan villagers, it now meant the Kosieri and the nearby commune of Kosnita were the last remaining holdouts this side of the river, two isolated specks in a sea of separatism. And there was no way the Transnistrians were going to leave them unconquered. The attack came on March the 13th. After the sun fell, Cossack-backed militia marched on Kosnita, at that time defended by just 15 policemen and some gun-owning locals. That night, short, sharp pops of rifle fire flared in the darkness. Shadowy figures tried to breach the hastily erected defenses. Villagers cowered in their homes. Yet the next day dawned with Kosnita still in Moldovan hands. Although one policeman had died and several volunteers had been wounded, the commune hadn't fallen. By now, though, the fighting was beginning to intensify. The day after the attack on Kosnita, Transnistrian forces destroyed bridges crossing the river. When they launched joint attacks on Kosnita and Kosieri on March the 17th, civilians were forced to flee across the wreckage, struggling through water as the war raged around them. The images taken that day of people swimming, of parents desperately trying to keep their children afloat, shocked the Moldovan public. War has begun, screamed the headlines. But that was already old news for anyone living in the Dubasari district. March saw some of the region's fiercest fighting as Kosnita and Kosieri fought against encirclement and government forces battled to retake Dubasari city. With hundreds dead and thousands fleeing, the international community tried to step in to do the geopolitical equivalent of dumping a bucket of cold water over an arguing couple. At high-level meetings, representatives of Moldova, Romania, Ukraine, and Russia tried to hammer out a deal. On March the 24th, a ceasefire was signed. But ceasefires themselves are merely bits of paper. They only count for something if those doing the signing translate them into action. And on the banks of the Dniester, the only actions being taken were of the military kind. As the fighting continued, Moldovan forces gathered for an attack on the Taina, also known by its unfortunate Russian name of Bender. A port on the Dniester, Taina was vital for both sides. For the Moldovans, because it lay on the western bank, and for the Transnistrians, because it sat just a stone's throw from their capital, Tiraspol. On the 1st of April, Moldovan police marched in, determined to dislodge the separatists and regain control of Bender. Maybe they could have done it. Maybe, in another universe, Europe's only city named after a Futurama character would today be in Moldovan hands. But not in this universe, because another major player is about to enter our story. Another player that's going to upend the conflict with serious firepower and brutal tactics. We're talking, of course, about Russia. Back in the Soviet era, the Moldovan SSR had been home to one of the largest ammunition dumps in Europe, at Glasnost on the East Bank. That meant it was also home to a whole bunch of Red Army troops guarding it. So when the USSR formally ceased to exist at the end of 1991, all those professional soldiers suddenly found themselves stranded on Transnistrian territory with no idea who was in charge. For Chisinau, the answer was simple. As the UN-recognized government of the former Moldovan SSR, they should have jurisdiction over the troops. There was even a tentative agreement in March 1992 on handing the soldiers over to Chisinau's command. But then April the 1st rolled around and Russia pulled the cruelest April Fool's prank of all. Just as Moldova's forces were entering Taina, Moscow declared control over the leftover troops and rechristened them the Russian 14th Army. A day later, their commander, Yury Netkachev, demanded Chisinau's forces immediately withdraw from Bender. The ultimatum marked the beginning of Russia's entry into the Transnistrian War, but it marked something else too, something equally important. The moment when any possibility of Moldova winning vanished in a puff of artillery smoke. The arrival of Russia as an active player in the conflict sent Moldova scrambling for a quick settlement. On April the 6th, Chisinau got representatives in four-way peace talks to agree the 14th Army should avoid active fighting. By the middle of the month, the tentative plan to deploy 400 international peacekeepers to implement a ceasefire had been agreed. Again, though, those actually on the ground would ignore all of this. As the talks dragged on, Russian armored vehicles rolled into Taina, missiles fell onto Kosieri and Kosnita. On May the 4th, the same day, an agreement on the withdrawal of the armed forces was signed. A bridge was blown up right near where the talks are being held. The day after, scores of pro-Moldovan villages were attacked. Desperate for an ally as powerful as the Russian bear, President Mircea Snegur called for an international force to come and restore order. But the UN just wasn't interested, especially while Moscow was alternating between denying its forces were even involved and claiming it needed to protect Russian speakers from a Moldovan extermination campaign. Some things never change. And so Moldova was left alone to try and fight its former overlord, a fight that climaxed in the middle of June 1992. By now, Chisinau had scaled back its goals from regaining control of the east bank of the Dniester to just holding what territory they could. On the 20th, their forces made one last major push into Bender in a wild attempt to claim the city and hold the entire western bank. Wild because the 14th Army had tanks nearby. And while the Moldovan forces would destroy at least 3 of them, those tanks would be more than happy to return fire. The brutal street fighting and long-range shelling that characterized the Battle for Bender was the bloodiest moment in the entire war. Over 2 days, the city was bombed while soldiers battled in the streets. When the smoke finally cleared, some 200 Moldovan fighters were dead and the city was littered with rubble. Perhaps more importantly, though, the battle had destroyed something else, something far more abstract, but no less vital: Moldova's dreams of losing with dignity. In the aftermath, Moscow declared it would commit more units if Moldova tried to reassert control over Transnistria. Faced with the prospect of a further battering, Chisinau agreed to talks that were sure to be humiliating. Over the next month, Moldovans got a crash course in how it feels to negotiate from a position of profound weakness. Proposals for an international peacekeeping force were rejected by Moscow, which instead demanded that security be guaranteed by a permanent presence of 1,500 Russian soldiers. As for Transnistria, it would remain legally a part of Moldova, but completely outside of Chisinau's control. Again, President Snegur tried to get some commitment from the international community, even if it was just contributing some peacekeepers. By now, though, much of the former Soviet sphere was in varying states of chaos. Down in Georgia, conflict had erupted around 2 separatist enclaves. In the Caucasus, Armenia and Azerbaijan were fighting over Nagorno-Karabakh. Over in Central Asia, Tajikistan was descending into civil war. With such bloodshed in the former Soviet republics, it's perhaps no surprise little attention was paid to this tiny scrap of land wedged between the Prat and Dniester rivers. A scrap of land that, anyway, had been contested for centuries. The Transnistrian War ended on July the 21st, 1992, with a ceasefire agreement in Moscow. In over 4 months of fighting, 1,132 people had been killed, over 3,500 wounded. 200,000 civilians had fled their homes, an incredible amount in a country with a population under 3 million. City streets and entire villages lay in ruins. Still, at least the killing had stopped. The conflict was over. Now, all that remained was to try and make something of the peace. Although the fighting had technically stopped on July the 21st, Russia's forces technically didn't give a f***. For the next several weeks, there were periodic attempts to dislodge the last Moldovan loyalists from Kosnita and Kosiera, usually by dropping bombs onto random civilians. But while the shelling would cause trouble, it was never strong enough to flatten the villagers or drive out the Moldovans. From now on, Chisinau would control this little enclave of territory on the east bank of the Dniester, just as Transnistria would forever hold the western bank's all-important city of Bender. Not that anyone thought it would be forever at the time. Despite the presence of Russian soldiers, the leaders of Chisinau still hoped to entice the separatists back into Moldova. From 1993 to 1994, unofficial negotiations were held on the nation's future shape, culminating in 2 important outcomes. The first was to place any sort of annexation into Romania into the not going to happen category. The second was to write a constitution that gave significant autonomy to both Transnistria and the breakaway Gagauz Republic in the south. Coming into force in 1994, the constitution was enough for the Gagauz people, who dropped their claim to independence. But it wasn't enough for the Transnistrians. The cleaving of Moldova into 2 would become permanent, with issues stemming from the war unresolved. The 2 sides would be plunged into a frozen conflict, one that continues to have repercussions. Today, 30 years later, the Transnistria War of 1922 occupies a strange place. For a long time, it was effectively forgotten by the wider world, a nasty but thankfully short and small-scale war fought in the shadow of the USSR's collapse, just one of a kaleidoscope of conflicts that played out at the end of Europe's last great empire. Indeed, so accustomed did post-war Chisinau and Tiraspol become to working with one another that you could almost imagine the after-effects had faded. When we researched our Transnistria video on geographics, we found dozens of articles warmly describing relations between the two sides as a model for frozen conflicts. But then came February the 24th, 2022, and everything changed. Following Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, fears began to grow that Moscow's peacekeepers stationed in Transnistria would pull the whole of Moldova into the crisis. That the outcome of this small war fought 3 decades ago might add a horrifying new dimension to a far, far bigger war being waged in the here and now. Since we often write and record these 3-4 weeks or more in advance, we have no way of knowing whether the dark prediction has come to pass. If it does, we can probably assume that the Transnistria War won't remain obscure much longer, that its inconclusive ends will soon be seen as fuel for a much greater conflagration 3 decades later. Obviously, we pray this won't be the case, but in these strange times, who can say for sure? All we can say is that, short and dirty as it was, the Transnistrian War may turn out to have been far more important than anyone ever realized. A grim warning from the past, predicting many of the horrors that are happening today.